In French, the word flânerie refers to the act of sauntering or strolling. The flâneur represents a literary type originating in 19th century Paris, carrying a diverse set of associations such as leisure, idleness, exploration, and urbanity. There is a certain kind of ambiguity which characterizes the flâneur and his privileged position in society that allows him to wander freely, disconnected from society, with apparently no other purpose than to be a detached observer of society. It was Walter Benjamin who, making use of the poetry of Charles Baudelaire, transformed this figure into an object of academic attention in the 20th century as an archetypal representative of urban and modern experience. The figure became a part of the exploration of the 19th century urban space and its surreal possibilities and depictions, and it has ever since gained an undisputed cognitive standing in contemporary theories of culture. Benjamin's conceptualization of the flâneur is not only restricted to an analysis of 19th century urban experience, it can be perceived as something that really encumbers such experience. This unfavorable upshot is a consequence of Benjamin's rather inflexible application of a high modernist aesthetic notion of self-loss derived from an idiosyncratic reading of Baudelaire and Edgar Allan Poe, to the construal of a journalistic connection intellectualizing the flâneur. The observations on urban space that Benjamin's ephemera of the 1930s and the 40s yield is liable to be terminated as deficient of cognitive value when compared with the methodologies of seeing articulated by Poe and Baudelaire. This termination or dismissal has resulted in a disregard for an entire genre of sketches of 19th century metropolitan life, particularly in deconstructive criticism. What has safeguarded Benjamin's assertions from being interrogated is not only their own critical drive fueled by Marxist and Freudian thought, but their inception in empirical textual analyses. Baudelaire was one of the first writers to explore in detail the idea of the flâneur, the casual saunterer, observer and correspondent of street life in the modern city. Baudelaire's flâneur was an aesthete and a dandy who strolled through the streets and arcades of 19th century Paris, watching and listening to the variegated appearances of modern urban life. The flaneur's mode of watching and the meaning that his ambling activity suggests are connected, and they prefigure a desire to attain a form of transcendence. The modernity of the city is predominantly defined by the activities of the flaneur observer, whose purpose is to glean, in Christopher Butler's words, the eternal from the transitory, and to see the poetic in the historic. The Arcades project uses Baudelaire's Flâneur as a point of departure for an examination of the influence of modern urban life upon the human psyche, with Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil providing Benjamin with the foundation of his colossal work on modernity, an unfinished study of the Paris arcades. For Benjamin, the poems in Flowers of Evil document the ambulatory gaze that the flaneur casts on Paris street life. It hardly ever bothered Benjamin that the halcyon days of Parisian arcades were long past. What he was concerned with was a worldview. All manifestations of succeeding civilizations, like modernity itself, were nothing but transient spectacles. The flaneur's perambulations are characterized by a curious kind of anachronism in that he makes explorations of the space of urban modernity and yet is persistently reminiscing about the past. The Arcades project primarily charts the history of Paris, the capital of the 19th century, whose structure constitutes an arterial network of imagination. In the Arcades project, Benjamin proposes two corresponding ideas in order to elucidate how human responses to modern city life are structured, namely Erlebnis and Erfahrung, With regard to urban experience, erlebnis can be considered as the shock-induced anesthesia caused by the crushing sensory overwhelming of life in a modern city, which is to some extent similar to the estranged subjectivity experienced by a worker tied to the demands of labor. Erfahrung, on the other hand, is a more constructive response and implies movement, the peripatetic itinerary of the Flâneur. The immediate experience of sights, sounds, and smells that the city offers. Benjamin is particularly concerned with the dialectic between erlebnis and Erfahrung, and conceptualizes Baudelaire's poetry as an effective medium for transforming erlebnis into Erfahrung. In an essay titled On Some Motives in Baudelaire, he writes, "The greater the share of the shock factor in particular impressions, the more constantly consciousness has to be alert as a screen against stimuli. The more efficiently it does so, the less do these impressions enter experience, that is Erfahrung, tending to remain in the sphere of a certain hour in one's life, that is Erlebnis." The city and its environment, and particularly the arcades, bring to mind for Benjamin evocations of the past. The common shared collective spaces where consciousness and the unconscious, past and present converge is offered by the material culture of the city rather than the psyche of the citizen. It is important to note that in the Arcades project, Benjamin does not merely write about the Flâneur, but writes as a Flâneur. The metaphor he chooses for his practice as a writer is ragpicking, who goes about exhuming the rags and refuse from his wide reading, his collection of a vast and eclectic range of quotations and obscurantisms. The fragments that make up the Arcades project can themselves be seen as textual detritus of Benjamin's research, a method that is reminiscent of Baudelaire's figure of the ragpicker who collects the rubbish scraps of modern existence and then reappropriates them in poetry. As Benjamin says, "The poets find the refuse of society on their streets and derive their heroic subject from this very refuse. This means that a common type is, as it were, superimposed upon their illustrious type. This new type is permeated by the features of the ragpicker, who made frequent appearances in Baudelaire's work." Benjamin also quotes from Baudelaire's description of this figure. "Here we have a man whose job it is to gather the day's refuse in the capital, everything that the big city has thrown away, everything it has lost, everything it has scorned, everything it has crushed underfoot, he catalogues and collects. He collates the annals of intemperance, the Capharnaum of waste. He sorts things out and selects judiciously. He collects, like a miser guarding a treasure, refuse which will assume the shape of useful or gratifying objects between the jaws of the goddess of industry." The ragpicker motif recurs throughout Benjamin's writing and offers a suitable metaphor for his textual practice, highlighting his interest in the peripheries of the modern city, foraging texts and oral histories that have been erased or ignored. This literary ragpicking involves resuscitating discarded and superfluous texts and recasting them into new narratives. Benjamin is not exactly interested in the city of the past for its own sake, but more importantly in the interstice between the imagined city and the material one. In his examination of the imagined city, Benjamin allocates specific significance to thresholds or portals. In ancient cultures, people had access to several rites of passage, changeover junctions, and triggers enabling them to cross from reason to myth and from one state of consciousness to another. In modernity, as Benjamin sees it, there is an impoverishment in terms of the loss of ability to make this crossover. He perceives the figure of the Flâneur as a contemporary and corresponding equivalent of this ability. Flâneur can enable one to find a way through crucial psychological and spiritual thresholds. In this connection, Benjamin also discusses the extent and reach of advertising and its surreal quality, its ability to connect commodities with the human imagination. Therefore, in accessing the dream world evoked by advertising, one makes a transition through a threshold, thereby attaining a kind of transcendence or partial transcendence in imitation of the gods from ancient religions, through which the shock experience of modernity is temporarily kept in check. Benjamin is not concerned with nostalgia for the past, but with formulating the critical knowledge essential for a radical and revolutionary break from the conformation to history's latest configurations. For him, the past is illuminated only when it is lit by the present, and the converse holds just as good to him. He says, every present is determined by those images which are synchronic with it. In his study of Paris's arcades, Benjamin discusses how the exterior spaces mirror the inside of buildings and vice versa. In fact, this observation underlies his overriding interest in the arcades and consolidates his belief that the arcades are able to bring together all kinds of consumer commodities in an ambience of assorted interiors and exteriors. With his deep interest in the issue of speciality, Benjamin amuses himself by asking questions such as whether the tables outside a cafe in an arcade are part of the interior or the exterior. He argues that the Flâneur experiences the streets as an interior that curiously unites all eras, all aspects of the world, and all singularities and phenomena of contemporary society. One instance of a gaze or a glance is capable of intoxicating the sense of sight of the Flâneur, stimulated to the very core of his being, leading to an almost corporeal internalization of the material world of commodities. Urban sites such as cafes, cinemas, and bookshops that pose an invitation to the stroller to enter and glance or browse can all be seen as a kind of addendum to the street. Benjamin grapples with the ambiguity that marks such sites and documents the construction of new dream spaces such as leisure parks, wax museums, and department stores, and interprets them as products of a new commodity culture and as places that summons the interest of the Flâneur. He develops the notion of dream space further and argues that gambling has a crucial psychological function in the new commodity culture. Although gambling is clearly an ill-considered and self-destructive form of activity, it offers the promise and expectation of a utopian dream with numerous choices and possibilities that are, however, laden with notions of superstition and fatalism. Since the Flâneur is poised to be the observer, the witness, and the stroller of the commodity-driven marketplace, he is a principal instrument for interpreting modern culture. This he does by synchronizing himself with the shock experience that modern life entails, without, however, putting up any form of resistance. The purpose of the Flâneur, claims Benjamin, is to generate an awakening, the moment at which the past and present recognize each other to produce true erfahrung. Benjamin thinks that one of the chief functions of writing is to salvage the cultural inheritance of the past in order to comprehend the present. He is not essentially interested in the cultural treasures of the past for their own sake, preferring the detritus and discarded objects of history over such cultural reserves of tradition. Influenced to a considerable extent by surrealism, he sees the Flâneur as a collector of urban images and a witness to an immense range of past objects, structures, and spaces that must be reassembled to produce an illuminating order. The figure of the Flâneur as a key motif for urban modernist writing has two itinerant avatars in Benjamin's writing: the idle bourgeois stroller of the arcades and his vagrant vagabond counterpart, the ragpicker. Both these incarnations are employed by Benjamin to generate speculations, on urban modernity, and for both the city is registered as a text to be extolled, read, redrafted and reread. The bourgeois Flâneur walks aimlessly through the city, eavesdropping on its unfolding narrative. The vagrant ragpicker too wanders across the urban landscape, but is more of a scavenger who goes about collecting, rereading and reworking its history. It is not that Flâneur in its modern form did not have to face ideological opposition. Totalitarian regimes opposed any act of loitering and idleness, interpreting them as a display of subversion. This is exemplified in the fascist banishment of prostitutes and vagrant dwellers from the streets in the 1930s and 40s. The Flâneur refuses to yield to such demands. Under capitalism, the processes involved in production often give rise to boredom, particularly with its speed-up mechanical technologies. The Flâneur, with his dandiesque equanimity, seems to be particularly antagonistic to the production process and to the social controls of modern industry in general.